first administration, George Washington. While we know Washington was leader of the Continental Army during the American Revolution and victorious, Washington will happily resign his military command at the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783. Upon his retirement and his resignation, he saw himself living out his days as a farmer in Mount Vernon, his homestead. But of course, we all know he will be called to lead this country again, but not in a military capacity, this time during a time of peace as the first president of the United States. The significance of this first presidential administration under our Constitution is really hard to overstate. You have to remember the Constitution provided a bare structural outline for the federal government, but how it would actually come together is still unclear. The precedent established by this first president would be enormous on how we handle day-to-day dealings regarding the president, the Congress, and the judiciary. The precedent established is enormous. Now, George Washington generally proceeded with great caution as the first president of the United States. For the most part, he continued precedents that had been established under the Articles of Confederation. For instance, he carried over the three departments of the government that had existed before the Constitution had been ratified. Now you have to remember, George Washington was a Federalist, so he did favor a stronger central government, and he made sure that that executive authority was independent from total legislative control, basically stating that the president does and is independent of the control of Congress. Now, George Washington would appoint his own head to each department of government whom the legislature body could only accept or reject. I do want you to remember that the Congress at this time and even today is independent of the presidency. So the president here, George Washington, is putting up his own secretary of the departments. And the first departments I want to talk about, the first three, are the Secretary of the State, Thomas Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton would be nominated for Secretary of Treasury, and Secretary of War would be Henry Knox, these three gentlemen on the slide. Secretary of War, or the Department of War, is no longer around today. We know them as the Department of Defense. So these are the three gentlemen. Now, if you remember, Thomas Jefferson is an anti-federalist. Alexander Hamilton is a staunch Federalist. So these two gentlemen have two different ideas of how government should be run. And in fact, George Washington likes that idea of having people with different ideas. Now, in his first term as president, George Washington had an enormous popularity in the country. He's a war hero of the American Revolution, and him being the first president and being so popular will enhance his legitimacy, and actually the legitimacy of the United States, this brand new country in the world stage. This brand new, very modest, very small. So George Washington, while sometimes we automatically throw him as a hero too fast, he actually does make a difference on why our country survives those first couple of years. He's very popular, and he's a war hero. He kind of lends legitimacy to the title as first president of the United States. And with his popularity, he can push for his people to be the heads of these departments. Now, although George Washington was enormously popular here in our new country, the United States, the country still faced some major problems. One of those problems facing the first federal government was how to deal with the financial chaos created by the American Revolution. As we know, wartime is expensive. It costs a lot of money to have a war. And England knew about that, right? After the French-Indian War, they were in debt and they had to raise taxes and acts here in the colonies, which kind of started this. Well, the United States has that same issue. In fact, the states, prior colonies, right, had huge war debts after the American Revolution. There's runaway inflation, meaning prices are inflated. It costs a lot more to buy something that it should. The price is inflated. That's where you get the term inflation. In fact, almost all areas of the economy looked dismal pretty bad throughout the 1780s. Economic hard times were a major factor, creating this sense of crisis that would produce a stronger central government under the Constitution. Kind of remember that the crises, this financial crisis that the young country is going through, will produce the need for a stronger central government. George Washington picked the talented Alexander Hamilton to be Secretary of the Treasury. In fact, Alexander Hamilton had served with George Washington throughout the Revolutionary War and took the challenge of directing the federal economic policy as the Treasury Secretary with pride. Hamilton is a fascinating character whose ambition fueled tremendous success as a self-made man. Hamilton, born in the West Indies to a single mother who was a shopkeeper, learned his first economic principles from her and went on to apprentice for a large mercantile firm. From these modest origins, Hamilton would become the foremost advocate for a modern capitalistic economy in the early national United States. In fact, Hamilton is credited with creating the capitalistic economic policy and fiscal policies that we still use to this day. The first issue that Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, had to address was the problem of public credit. If you remember, wars are expensive, and governments at all levels during the Revolution had taken on so much debt during the Revolution, meaning the colonies at the time, during the Revolution, later to be known as states, had borrowed money from private investors, had borrowed a lot of money to finance the war. Now that the war is over, the Revolutionary War is over, the commitment by the states to pay them back was not taken very seriously, meaning the states weren't going to be paying back these investors, this financial class that had lent the states, the colonies at the time, the money to fight the war. By the late 1780s, the value of such public securities had plunged to a small fraction of their face value, meaning these IOUs that the states had given to these investors was practically worthless. Hamilton would propose that the federal government should pay off all the loans that the states had at full value. So if a state borrowed $100, and I'm making that number up, from investor A, the federal government took that on and would pay that off for the state. Such action would dramatically enhance the legitimacy of the new central government, of the federal government. Now, to raise money to pay off the debts of the states, Hamilton would issue new securities bonds. A bond, for my non-economic students out there, is basically you buy a bond for, let's say, $50 and you keep it. And if you keep it for 10 years, you can cash it out for, let's say, $100. That's kind of what a bond is. So the U.S. government would be selling these securities, these bonds, to raise money to pay off the debts of the states. Now, it is a little bit of helping out the wealthier classes in the sense that investors who had purchased these public securities, these bonds, would make enormous profits when the time came for the United States to pay them off in whatever number of years was agreed upon. It's these same investors that had lent states money during the war, the Revolutionary War. They would kind of get money twice, if you think about it. They had lent out the money to the states during the Revolutionary War, and at some point they go, we're not getting our money back from the states. Here comes the federal government, says, don't worry, we're going to pay you the full value. We're going to pay you the full value. And these same investors that got paid out by the federal government will buy those securities and bonds, and then in a certain number of years, they'd make double their money back. So there was enormous profits to be made by a certain class here in the United States. At this time, Hamilton wanted to reshape the American economy even more, and he wanted to create a federal charter for a national financial institution. He proposed a Bank of the United States. He remodeled this bank after the Bank of England, it being a central bank which would help make the new nation's economy dynamic through a more stable paper currency. At some point, the colonies and now later the states would actually be printing up their own money depending on each state's financial position. Hamilton said this was a big no-no. There would be only one currency, and that would be the United States currency, which the Bank of the United States would handle and create a stable, dynamic currency. So Hamilton does vision reshaping the American economy along the lines of England, and one of those ways is through a Bank of the United States, much like the Bank of England. Now, many did oppose a national bank of the United States. Many feared it would fall under the influence of wealthy urban Northeasterners and speculators from overseas. But with the support of President George Washington, the bank was chartered with its first headquarters in Philadelphia. Now, the last thing, in fact, one of the most important economic things that Hamilton was concerned about was America's ability to manufacture and be self-sufficient. Now, we had traditionally rested upon our agricultural output, meaning the United States was primarily an agricultural country at this point, meaning we raised crops and we sold those crops overseas for the importation of manufactured goods. Hamilton rightly believed that dependence on expensive foreign goods would keep the American economy at a limited level, and he didn't want to have that. In fact, he tried to reverse this to some degree through the use of government subsidies to business, to manufacturers here in the United States, and putting tariffs on goods coming into the United States. Subsidies meaning if you made a clock here in the United States, we would give you $1 for each clock you made, or we take $1 off the price. We would help you build that clock to be made in America, made in the United States. Now, if a British clockmaker wanted to send clocks to the United States, we would add $1 to the price for them importing it and selling it, thus giving American businesses an advantage over overseas businesses. And in fact, we see this today. This policy is known as protectionist policy, and it did help the fledgling American producers to compete with the inexpensive, cheap goods of European imports. Now, Hamilton's policies regarding manufacturing and banking and credit were all kind of suspect to many here in the United States, but they are still policies here in the United States today, way after his death. Now, they are controversial to an extent during that time period, and even today we could kind of argue. These policies were pro-British regarding we wanted to kind of emulate and copy what the British did regarding the banking and their mercantilist ways. But probably the most kind of concerning was his belief in an even stronger central government. Remember, he's a Federalist, and he believed that the Constitution needed to create a stronger central government because he linked democratic impulses, meaning the will of the people, tended to lead to potential anarchy, which one could argue to an extent. But he was kind of worried about the masses, and he believed we needed a stronger central government. Now, regardless of what you think of Hamilton's policies back then or even today, they are the touchstones of the modern American capitalistic economy. Alexander Hamilton's economic policies were among the earliest sources of tension in this new republic, the United States. They would spark strong reactions not only from elected officials and ordinary farmers who kind of feared the Northeast and this wealthy class that are doing this with economic policy and national banks, which they're fearful of, but it actually split George Washington's cabinet, and the strongest opposition in the cabinet was from Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, a strong anti-federalist, fearful of a strong central government. Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of the State at the time, he thought Hamilton's plans for full payment of public debt stood to benefit a corrupt squadron of paper dealers. He was fearful that this was just a massive payoff to the wealthy classes who are going to make an enormous amount of profit by moving paper around, meaning, we're paying off that debt that was owed to them during the Revolution, and now we're going to let them buy these bonds, which we're just paying them back again, and then they're going to make a profit once the bond matures. So this quote from Thomas Jefferson kind of gives you an idea of what he thought about Hamilton and Hamilton's policy. All it did was create a corrupt squadron of paper dealers. Now, Alexander Hamilton was successful in his bid to get that National Bank of the United States, the charter, and of course Thomas Jefferson opposed it because their disagreement about the bank stemmed from a sharply opposed interpretation of the Constitution. You got to remember the Constitution. For Thomas Jefferson, the chartering of the bank was clearly beyond the powers granted to the federal government in our Constitution. In his strict interpretation, and I want you to remember strict interpretation of the Constitution, Jefferson pointed out that the 10th Amendment required that all federal authority be expressly stated in the law. Nowhere did the Constitution allow for the federal government to create a bank. He's a strict constitutionalist with a strict interpretation, meaning that if it's not in the Constitution, the federal government cannot do this. Now, Hamilton would reply and respond with, he is using a loose interpretation of the Constitution that would allow such federal action under a clause permitting Congress to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper, which is in the Constitution. Opposition to Hamilton's financial policy spread beyond the cabinet. We would see America start to break into two halves, right? Constitutionalists with a strict interpretation and constitutionalists with a loose interpretation. We still deal with these issues today, right? Some would say that the federal government has too much power, that they can't do that. It's not in the Constitution, and if it's not in the Constitution written specifically regarding an issue, the federal government can't do it. Now, we'll have those on the opposing side saying, well, it's a loose interpretation. And there is a clause in our Constitution that says that Congress can make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. And even today, students, we're dealing with this issue of, can Congress do certain things? Or can Congress not do certain things? It's regarding the Constitution and the interpretation. Now, the Congress, the legislature, was divided about whether or not to support the Bank of the United States. This split in Congress loomed as a potential threat to the Union because Northern representatives overwhelmingly voted favorably, while Southerners were strongly opposed to this national bank. So we start to see the North and the South, like I mentioned earlier, start to shift away, have stark differences. Northern states favor Hamilton's Bank of the United States, while Southern states, which tended to be primarily agricultural, did not support this Bank of the United States. Strongly opposed. Now, the differences stem from significant economic differences between the sections, though, the North and the South. Think about it. Large cities, merchants, and leading financiers were much more numerous in the North and stood to benefit the most from Hamilton's plans, while the South, primarily agriculture, were suspicious of this because they were primarily agriculture, not a lot of business or banking interests in the South at this time, and they saw this just as a way for the North to gain an advantage or leverage or power within Congress and economically. Observers began to fear that we start to see this sharp sectional differences, and this could actually threaten the Union, our fairly young country, between the North and the South. Now, we know what's going to happen later, but we start to see these sectional differences highlighted. Indeed, the bank ultimately found support in Congress through a compromise. We actually have a compromise to get the bank. The compromise is there's a commitment to build a new federal capital on the banks of the Potomac River. In part, this stemmed from the fact that southern states such as Virginia had already paid off their war debt and stood nothing to gain by the federal bank paying off debts. Virginia had already paid it off, so they weren't worried about having their debt covered. They'd done it already. While most of the commercial beneficiaries of Hamilton's policies were concentrated in the urban Northeast, the political capital of Washington, D.C. would stand more in the agricultural South. So the compromise is we're going to create the political power base in the South, in Washington, D.C., which was considered part of the South at the time, and the economic power would be located more in the Northeast, with that Bank of the United States located in Philadelphia. This compromise, this economic and political power compromise, was hoping to avoid a dangerous concentration in any one place. We kind of see the concentration of political power in the South, in Washington, D.C., and economic power in the North, in Philadelphia. Now, while this compromise did settle the situation for a few years, I do want to stress that we start to see the 1790s point toward an uncertain future. The Virginian Jefferson and the New Yorker Hamilton serve as useful figureheads for the opposing sides. Hamilton was an adamant he was an elitist who his policies favored merchants and financiers, meaning banks and those with wealth, with money to spend and to loan. While Jefferson, he was wealthy. Don't get me wrong. He favored policies aimed towards ordinary farmers. And on this slide, we kind of have their description, right? Alexander Hamilton, he's a New Yorker from the Northeast. He's wealthy. He's an elitist. His policies favored merchants and financiers, and he's a strong Federalist. While Thomas Jefferson, on the other end of the spectrum, he's a Virginian. He is wealthy, don't get me wrong, but he's more of the people, and his policies favored ordinary farmers, and he's an adamant, strong anti-Federalist. These differences also extended to the branch of government that each favored. Hamilton thought a strong executive and judiciary protected from the dangers of popular influence, which are essential to the health of a republic. By contrast, Jefferson put much greater faith in democracy and felt that the truest expression of Republican principles will come through the legislature, meaning the Congress, which was directly elected by the people. So Hamilton kind of fears the people because of anarchy and other things that could happen, while Jefferson puts more faith in the people and the legislation and Congress. These differences between these gentlemen and also society would become even sharper as the decade wears on. Let's talk about the French Revolution. This is not a world history course, but we need to talk about it because the French Revolution brought a fundamental change to the feudal order of monarchical and aristocratic privilege. In fact, Americans widely celebrated the French Revolution in its glorious opening in 1789, as it struck at the very heart of absolutist power, which we had fought a revolution over just years earlier. And in fact, France seemed to be following the American Republican example by creating a constitutional monarchy where traditional elites would be restrained by written law. Where the king had previously held absolute power, now he would have to act with clear legal boundaries, much like ourselves, right, with our American Revolution. But the French Revolution soon moved beyond this already considerable assault on traditional order. Largely pushed by a crisis brought on by a war that began in 1792 against Prussia and Austria, the French Revolution took a dramatic turn. Climaxing with the beheading of King Louis XVI and the abandonment of Christianity in favor of a state religion based on reason, the French Revolution became far more radical than the American Revolution ever became. In addition to the period of extreme public violence, which became known as the Reign of Terror, the French Revolution also attempted to enhance the rights and power of poor people and women, in fact. It even went as so far as to outlaw slavery in the French colonies in the Caribbean. Domestic attitudes towards the proper future of the American Republic grew even more intense as a result of examples of the revolutionary France. Conservatives like Hamilton, Washington, and others who would soon organize as the Federalist political party saw the French Revolution as an example of homicidal anarchy. They were just going too far. When Great Britain joined European allies in the war against France in 1793, Federalists supported this action as an attempt to enforce proper order. Now, the opposing American view, held by Jefferson and others who came to organize as the Democratic Republicans political party, supported the French actions. This was an extension of a worldwide Republican struggle against corrupt monarchy and aristocratic privilege. Let me give you a takeaway on this. Is the French Revolution mirrors the American Revolution in many ways. And you can see it. It's bringing down of a king. It's more power to the people, getting rid of absolute rule. But at some point in the French Revolution, it kind of goes off the rails. And in this slide, we have a picture of the famous guillotine, people losing their heads. Initially, people of privilege, royals, aristocrats. But it does go off the rails where people just being accused of being sympathizers or not falling in line are beheaded at the will of the people. And this is where people like Hamilton and Washington kind of jump off the bus and say, hey, we're not with that. While Thomas Jefferson, who believes in the people at all times, will support the French Revolution all the way through, even at the urging of others to, you want to rethink this. The French are going a little cuckoo nuts here. But the French Revolution is kind of the American Revolution on steroids, when it comes to blood in the streets. It's actually known as a reign of terror. So this is going on the other part of the world, kind of taking an example or the leadership of the U.S. of what we did. The French Revolution takes place also.